Hey everyone, and welcome back to Chat Like a Native. So, we're all on this journey to, sound more natural and fluent in English. But even when you've been studying for a while, there are these sneaky little errors that can kind of trip you up.
Yeah.
Today we're going deep on those common mistakes that even advanced learners make. We'll uncover the why, and more importantly, give you some tools to avoid them so you can really level up your English game.
It's like you've been practicing your tennis serve for ages and think you've got it down, but then your coach points out this tiny little wrist flick that's throwing off your whole game.
Yeah.
It's those subtle things that can make a big difference.
Exactly. And sometimes it's hard to even realize you're making those mistakes until someone points them out.
Yeah.
So we'll be your friendly English coaches today,
Absolutely.
breaking down those tricky areas and giving you some actionable tips. We'll be focusing on tenses, prepositions, and sentence structure.
And I think what's interesting is that these aren't necessarily complex grammar concepts. It's more about the nuances and the subtle ways that English works, which can be tricky even for experienced learners.
Okay, so let's dive right in with tenses. I feel like I understand the basics, but sometimes I still get tripped up. Like I was writing an email the other day and almost typed, "I have seen him yesterday."
Oh.
Thankfully, I caught myself, but it made me realize how easy it is to slip up, even with something as basic as the past tense.
That's a perfect example. You see, your brain wants to connect the past action of seeing him to the present moment, which is where the present perfect tense comes in. But that pesky word yesterday throws a wrench in the works.
So how do I know when to use the present perfect versus the simple past?
Time markers are key. Words like yesterday, last week, or 2 days ago clearly signal a specific time in the past.
Right.
So you need to use the simple past tense. The present perfect is more for actions that have a connection to the present, like, I have visited Paris 3 times. It implies that the experience of visiting Paris is still relevant to you now.
Okay, so if I had said, I have seen him recently, that would have been okay, right? Because recently is less specific than yesterday.
Exactly. Recently connects the action to the present, making the present perfect a suitable choice. Think of it like drawing a timeline. If you can pinpoint the action on the timeline with a specific time, you'll likely need the simple past. If the action is more general or connected to now, the present perfect might be a better fit.
That timeline visual is really helpful. I used to think those were just for beginners, but I can see how they can come in handy even at a more advanced level.
Absolutely. Sometimes going back to those basic visual aids can help solidify your understanding, especially when you're dealing with tricky grammar concepts.
Another area I sometimes struggle with is the continuous and perfect tenses. I catch myself saying things like, I have been finishing the project, instead of, I finished the project. Why does English have to be so complicated?
I know, right? But don't worry, there's a logic to it. Think about what you're trying to emphasize. I have been finishing implies that the process of finishing was ongoing. But if you're simply stating that the project is done, I have finished is the way to go.
So it's about the emphasis on the duration versus the completion of the action.
Precisely. If you want to highlight that you were working on the project for a while, have been finishing works. If you just want to say it's done and dusted, use the simple past participle, have finished.
Okay, that makes sense. I think I need to practice those more. Maybe write some sentences with both options to really get a feel for the difference.
That's a great idea. And remember, it's okay to make mistakes. That's how we learn and refine our language skills.
I think we've tackled tenses pretty well. Are you ready to move on to the next challenge?
Bring it on. What have we got?
Prepositions. They're like those tiny little words that can cause a world of trouble.
Oh, I completely agree. They can be quite the puzzle, even for native speakers.
For me, it's not so much about the individual prepositions themselves, but more about how they work in phrases. Like, I'll know what at and in mean, but then I'll get confused about whether to say at the weekend or in the weekend.
I see what you mean. Prepositions are often best learned within the context of specific phrases or collocations.
Okay.
Instead of memorizing at in isolation, memorize at the weekend, at night, at 5 p.m., and so on. Treat them as chunks of language rather than individual words.
That's a great tip. So it's almost like learning a new vocabulary word, except it's a phrase with a preposition in it.
Exactly. And the more you expose yourself to authentic English, the more you'll naturally pick up these phrases and how they're used. Reading, listening to podcasts, watching movies, it all helps.
Speaking of confusing phrases with prepositions, what about those idiomatic expressions? Like good at or interested in.
Yeah.
It feels like there's no logic to them. You just have to memorize them.
You're absolutely right. Idiomatic expressions are tricky because they don't always follow the usual grammar rules. You can't analyze each word separately. You have to learn the whole phrase as a unit.
It's like they have their own special grammar rules that only apply within that specific phrase.
Precisely. And unfortunately, there's no magic formula for figuring them out. The best approach is to treat them as vocabulary words and learn them through exposure and practice.
Right.
Make flashcards, create example sentences, and try using them in your everyday conversations.
That's a good point. It's all about actively using the language, not just memorizing rules.
Absolutely. Language is about communication, and the more you use it in real-life situations, the more confident and fluent you'll become. It's like learning a new dance move. At first, you're just trying to get the steps right, but then you start to understand the rhythm, the flow, and how it all comes together.
That's a great analogy. And just like with dancing, practice is key.
Mm-hmm.
But, sometimes I feel like I'm practicing the wrong things, or I don't know where to focus my efforts. Any tips on how to practice effectively?
Absolutely. One of the best ways to practice is through immersion. Surround yourself with authentic English as much as possible. Read books, watch movies, listen to podcasts like this one. Pay attention to how native speakers use prepositions in different contexts, how they construct their sentences, and how they express themselves naturally.
So it's not just about studying grammar rules, it's about absorbing the language organically.
Exactly. Think of it like learning to cook. You can read all the recipes you want, but until you get in the kitchen and start experimenting, you won't truly develop your skills.
That makes sense. It's about getting your hands dirty, making mistakes, and learning from them.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to experiment. Try using those tricky prepositions in your own sentences, even if you're not sure if you're getting them right. The more you use the language, the more you'll develop an intuitive sense of what sounds right and what doesn't.
I like that. It's about taking risks and not being afraid to make mistakes. Speaking of mistakes, let's move on to our final topic, sentence structure. This is something I've always struggled with, even when I feel like my grammar is correct.
Sentence structure is a common stumbling block even for advanced learners. It's one thing to know the individual words and grammar rules, but it's another thing to put them together in a way that sounds natural and flows smoothly.
I think one of my biggest challenges is word order. Sometimes I'll construct a sentence that's grammatically correct, but it just sounds awkward. For example, I might say something like, "Never I have seen such a beautiful sunset." It feels wrong, even though all the words are technically correct.
You're right. It does sound a bit off. In English, we usually place words like never before the auxiliary verb have for emphasis. So the more natural way to say it would be, I have never seen such a beautiful sunset.
I see. So it's not just about grammar, it's also about style and how we emphasize different parts of the sentence.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to pay attention to how native speakers structure their sentences. Notice where they place adverbs, how they use conjunctions, and how they vary their sentence length and structure to create rhythm and flow.
So it's about developing an ear for the music of the language.
Precisely. Think of it like composing a piece of music. You have your individual notes and chords, but it's the arrangement, the timing, and the dynamics that bring the music to life.
Okay, I'm starting to see sentence structure in a whole new light now. It's not just about rules, it's about artistry.
That's a great way to put it. And just like with any art form, it takes practice and experimentation to master it.
Another area I struggle with is combining sentences, creating those compound or complex structures. I get so lost in conjunctions and commas.
Combining sentences is a skill that allows you to express more complex ideas and create more sophisticated writing and speech. It's about understanding the relationship between different clauses and using conjunctions and punctuation to connect them smoothly.
I know the basic conjunctions like and, but, and, or, but I would get confused about which one to use and where to put the commas.
Think of conjunctions as bridges that connect different parts of your sentence. Each conjunction has a specific purpose and meaning, so it's important to choose the one that best reflects the relationship between the clauses you're joining.
So and is like a simple footbridge, just connecting two ideas, while but is more like a drawbridge, signaling a contrast or change in direction.
That's a fantastic analogy. And as for commas, they act like traffic signals, guiding the reader or listener through the sentence and preventing any collisions of meaning.
I love that visual. So how do I know when to use a comma before a conjunction?
A good rule of thumb is to use a comma before a conjunction when you're joining two independent clauses. That is, two clauses that could stand alone as separate sentences. For example, I went to the store, but it was closed.
So if one of the clauses is dependent, like a fragment that can't stand alone, I don't need a comma.
Exactly. For example, I went to the store because I needed milk. The because clause is dependent on the first clause to make sense, so no comma is needed.
Okay, that clears things up a bit, but I still feel like there's so much to learn about sentence structure.
There's always more to learn, but the key is to practice and experiment. Pay attention to the way native speakers construct their sentences and try imitating their patterns in your own writing and speech. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how you learn and grow.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today. Tenses, prepositions, sentence structure. It feels like we've uncovered a whole treasure trove of potential pitfalls for English learners. But you know what? I'm actually feeling more confident, not less.
That's the goal. It's not about feeling overwhelmed by all these rules. It's about increasing your awareness so you can start noticing these errors, not just in your own speech, but also in the English you encounter every day.
And that's what I love about this podcast. It's called Chat Like a Native for a reason. We're all about taking those extra steps to refine our English and really sound like we know what we're doing. But let's be honest, even native speakers make mistakes, right?
Of course, language is constantly evolving, and there are always exceptions to the rules. The important thing is to be open to learning to embrace mistakes as opportunities to grow. And that brings us to another important point. How do we actually get better at all this?
Yeah, we've talked about the problems, but what about the solutions? Give us the goods.
Well, first and foremost, don't let the fear of making mistakes stop you from speaking or writing. The more you practice, the more comfortable you'll become and the fewer mistakes you'll make over time.
It's like anything else, right? Practice makes progress. But practice can be daunting. Do you have any tips for making it more fun and effective?
Absolutely. Immersion is key. Surround yourself with authentic English content, books, movies, podcasts, music. Not only is it enjoyable, but you're also passively absorbing the natural rhythms and nuances of the language.
And don't forget about the amazing online resources we have these days. There are grammar checkers, language learning apps, even online communities where you could practice with other learners.
It's true. Technology has made language learning so much more accessible. But at the end of the day, nothing beats real-life interaction. If you can find opportunities to converse with native speakers or language partners, it's the best way to put all your knowledge into practice and get feedback in real time.
So true. I remember when I first started speaking English more regularly, I was so nervous about making mistakes. But the more I spoke, the more confident I became, and I learned so much in those conversations. It's amazing how much you can pick up just by interacting with others.
It is, and don't be afraid to ask questions. Native speakers are usually happy to help, and they can often explain those tricky grammar points in a way that makes sense.
All right, so we've got immersion practice and don't be afraid to make mistakes. Any other golden nuggets of advice before we wrap up?
One last thing. Be patient with yourself. Learning a language takes time and effort. There will be moments of frustration, but don't give up. Celebrate your progress no matter how small. And remember, the journey of language learning is just as rewarding as the destination.
I love that perspective. It's not about reaching some, mythical level of perfection. It's about enjoying the process of learning and constantly improving. And, what we've been talking about today applies to any language, not just English. It's about those universal principles of language learning. Paying attention to detail, embracing mistakes, and immersing yourself in the language.
That's so true. It's like we've been decoding the secrets of how to really internalize a language and make it a part of who you are.
Exactly. It's not just about memorizing grammar rules. It's about developing an ear for the nuances, the rhythms, the way native speakers actually use the language. And that comes from consistent practice, from surrounding yourself with English, from having those real-life conversations.
And it's about having fun with it. Don't be afraid to experiment, to play with the language, to make those mistakes and learn from them. The more you relax and enjoy the process, the more natural and fluent you'll become.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. To all of our listeners out there, keep practicing, keep exploring, and keep chatting. Because the more you use English, the more confident and natural you'll sound.
And remember, we're all on this journey together, so let's support each other, celebrate our progress, and have fun along the way.
Until next time, happy chatting.